The Winchester cracked twice across the Nevada desert. Then silence. Elijah Stone lay flat behind a boulder, his face pressed against hot sand, blood trickling from a cut above his left eye. He counted the seconds between shots. 2 rifles up there on the ridge, maybe 3. Hard to tell with the echo bouncing off the canyon walls like the land itself was trying to confuse him. The buckskin horse he had ridden for 6 years was dead 20 feet away, still bleeding into the dirt. Its legs had stopped twitching, but Elijah could still see the light fading from its dark eyes. 6 years that horse had carried him through Apache country, through blizzards in Wyoming, through the worst nights of his life, when whiskey could not touch the pain, and only riding kept the memories from closing in. Now it was meat and flies, and the flies were already gathering. Stone. A voice echoed from the ridge above, confident, almost bored. The voice of a man holding all the cards and enjoying the view. "We know you are alive down there. Come out nice and slow. We make it quick. Stay hidden. We make it slow. Real slow. Your choice friend." Elijah checked his Colt .45. 4 rounds left in the cylinder. His Winchester Model 1873 lay 3 feet away, half buried in sand where it had fallen when he dove for cover. Maybe 8 rounds in the magazine. Not enough. Not nearly enough for 3 men with high ground and all the time in the world. He was 43 years old, a veteran of Antietam, Fredericksburg, the wilderness. He had seen men die in ways that still visited him in nightmares, had killed more than he could count, and buried friends he still missed on cold mornings when the wind carried voices that were not there. And now he was going to die in a Nevada wash for a woman he had known less than 12 hours. The sun beat down merciless and white. Sweat ran into his eyes, mixing with the blood. His shoulder throbbed where a bullet had grazed him an hour ago, and each heartbeat sent a fresh wave of heat down his arm. Somewhere behind him, pressed against the canyon wall in a sliver of shade, a young woman waited in silence. She wore a wedding dress, white once. Now it was torn at the shoulder, stained with dust and dried blood, the hem shredded from 3 days of running through terrain that showed no mercy. Her feet were bare, the soles cracked and bleeding, and she held a bundle wrapped in oilcloth against her chest like it was the last thing in the world worth protecting. Elijah could hear her breathing. Steady, controlled. The breathing of someone who had been hunted before and learned that panic was the fastest way to die. How the hell did it come to this? But before that answer, before the bullets and the blood and the canyon and the wedding dress, there is something you need to understand about the man behind the boulder. Something about a mountain, something about silence, and something about a boy named Tommy Graves, whose last words still echoed through every decision Elijah Stone would ever make. 3 days earlier, Elijah had been riding alone through the Nevada-California borderland. Empty country, brutal country. The kind of land that swallowed men whole and never gave back their bones. The sky stretched so wide and so blue, it made a man feel like the last living thing on earth, and some days Elijah preferred it that way. He rode the ridgeline with his eyes sweeping the horizon in a pattern he had learned 23 years ago at Antietam and never unlearned. Left, right behind, left again. Every few seconds, automatic as breathing. Most men lost that habit after the war ended. Elijah never did. The war had ended for the country. It had not ended for him. He stopped his horse at a creek that cut through the rocks, dismounted in one smooth motion, the kind of movement that came from a life lived entirely outdoors, efficient, unhurried, not a single wasted gesture. He knelt by the water and splashed his face with the cold, checked the horse's hooves, checked his ammunition. These were the rituals that kept him anchored to the world when everything else had come loose. His cabin sat at 8,000 feet on the Sierra Nevada range. He had felled the timber himself. Pine mostly cut with an axe he had sharpened so many times the head was half its original size. He had notched the logs, fitted them, chinked the gaps with mud, and moss built the chimney from riverstone carried up the mountain one load at a time. It was not a large cabin. It did not need to be. It only needed to hold one man and his silence. He trapped beaver in the high streams and hunted deer in the meadows below the tree line. Every 6 weeks or so, he rode 3 days down to a trading post and exchanged pelts for ammunition, salt, coffee, and flour. He spoke to the trader, he spoke to his horse, he spoke to no one else. Some months an entire cycle of the moon would pass without the sound of a human voice reaching his ears, and he had learned to find a kind of peace in that absence, or at least something that resembled peace if you did not look at it too closely. His beard reached his chest, dark brown streaked with gray. His hair was tied back with a strip of leather. He wore a coat of deer hide he had tanned himself, a raccoon fur hat when the wind came down from the peaks, and boots worn smooth from 10,000 miles of mountain trails. He looked more like a part of the landscape than a part of the human race, and that was not an accident. That was a choice. A man who looked like the mountain was a man the mountain would not kill. The Winchester rifle rested across his saddle, loaded and ready. Always loaded, always ready. That rifle had killed Confederate soldiers at Antietam when Elijah was barely 20 years old and still believed in words like glory and honor and duty. It had killed Apache raiders near Tucson 3 winters back when they came for his horse in the dark and found something worse than a horse waiting for them. And it had killed 3 of Marcus Denton's men on the night everything collapsed, the night that sent Elijah up the mountain and into the silence and away from every living soul he had ever cared about. Denton. The name still tasted like metal on his tongue, like blood that had not dried, like a wound that had scabbed over but never healed underneath, still raw, still red, still waiting to be torn open by the wrong word or the wrong memory, or a night when the wind blew from the wrong direction and carried sounds that were not really there. But that is a story for later. First, the tracks. Elijah saw them from the ridgeline. Fresh boot prints in the dry wash below, cutting through the sandy bottom of a creek bed that had not seen water in months. Someone running hard. The stride pattern told him everything he needed to know before his mind even formed the words desperation, panic, exhaustion. The kind of running that came from being hunted like an animal with nowhere left to hide and no strength left to keep going, but going anyway because stopping meant something worse than tired legs and burning lungs. And behind those tracks, 2 sets of heavier prints, steady, methodical, spaced evenly apart. Hunters who knew their prey was running out of strength and were in no hurry because they understood what every predator understands, that time was on their side, that exhaustion did the killing for you if you were patient enough to let it. One more detail. The running footprints were small, light, and they were bare. Whoever was fleeing had lost their shoes a long time ago. Elijah sat on his horse at the ridgeline and stared down at those tracks for a long moment. He could ride on, could tell himself it was none of his concern, could remind himself that getting involved meant risk and risk meant loss, and he had sworn off caring about anyone ever again because caring meant pain, and he had carried enough pain to bend the spine of a man twice his size. 2 years he had lived on that mountain. 2 years without attachment, without connection, without another soul to worry about or grieve for, or bury in hard ground while trying not to think about how the dirt sounded hitting the wood. 2 years of choosing isolation because isolation was the only thing that could not be taken from him. But he saw Tommy's face in his mind, clear as the Nevada sky above him, that eager smile, those trusting eyes that saw good in everything and everyone until the day the world proved him wrong in the worst possible way. And he heard Tommy's voice, the voice that visited him every night before sleep and every morning before dawn, asking the only question that had ever mattered. Did I do good? Elijah touched the horse's flanks with his heels and started down the ridge. He found her in a narrow canyon where the walls pressed close and the shadows pooled thick and dark, even in the middle of the day. The kind of place where the sun only reached for an hour at noon, and the rest of the time belonged to shade and stone and the small creatures that lived in the cracks. She was pressed against the rock face like she was trying to melt into the stone itself, trying to disappear, trying to become part of the mountain the way Elijah had tried to become part of his mountain for 2 years. And the first thing he noticed was the dress, a wedding dress. White fabric now torn at the shoulder, stained brown and red with dust and dried blood. The hem was in shreds, ripped apart by sagebrush and rock, and 3 days of running through country that cared nothing for lace or satin or the dreams that dresses like that were supposed to represent. Her hair had come loose from whatever arrangement it had been in dark strands falling across her face, tangled with dry leaves and dirt. Her feet were bare. The soles were cracked and bleeding, the skin torn by 100 sharp stones. She was 22 years old, beautiful in a way that went beyond the arrangement of features, the kind of beauty that came from strength, from survival, from refusing to break when everything in the world was trying to shatter you into pieces small enough to sweep away and forget. A knife wound on her forearm was still bleeding, sluggish and red. Bruises marked both arms in patterns that told stories without words. The purple and yellow impressions of fingers that had grabbed and squeezed and held 5 distinct marks on her left wrist like a brand pressed into flesh. She held a jagged rock in her free hand, her weapon ready to fight, even though she must have known she could not win against what was coming. In her other arm, pressed tight against her chest, she clutched something wrapped in oilcloth, something she had not let go of despite everything. Her eyes fixed on Elijah as he dismounted, blue-gray light and sharp in the afternoon sun, eyes that had seen too much and trusted too many and been betrayed too often, eyes that had learned not to hope because hope was just a longer fall. Elijah kept his hands visible, moved slowly, the way you approach a wounded animal that might bolt or bite because it has learned that every hand that reaches toward it brings pain. "Easy," he said. "I am not with them." That is what the last one said. Her voice was steady despite everything, controlled, the voice of someone holding herself together by will alone, before he tried to take what he wanted. "I am not the last one." She studied him, read his face the way a card player reads a hand, looking for the tell, looking for the crack in the mask that would reveal the truth behind the words. Her eyes moved from his hands to his rifle to his face and back to his hands again, measuring, calculating, deciding whether this man was another predator wearing the skin of a rescuer or something she had stopped believing existed. And then she spoke, and her words changed everything. Her voice went flat, cold, empty. The voice of a woman who had learned the hard way that hope was just disappointment waiting to happen, that kindness was just cruelty wearing a better coat, that every man who said "I will help" really meant "I will take." "Mister, do you only want my body like all the others?" The question hit Elijah harder than any bullet ever had, not because it was crude, because it was honest, raw, real, stripped of every pretense and every courtesy and every social nicety that people hide behind when the truth is too ugly to say out loud. It was the question of a 22-year-old woman who had been traded by her family like livestock, hunted by men who saw her as property, chased across a desert by killers who wanted what she carried and did not care whether she was alive or dead when they took it. The question carried in it every violation she had endured, every hand that had grabbed without asking, every promise that had turned to ash in her mouth, every moment she had been reduced to flesh, and nothing more. Elijah had been asked many things in his 43 years, asked to kill men he had never met for a cause he barely understood, asked to watch friends die and keep marching, asked to testify against a man he knew would walk free, asked to forget, asked to move on, asked to pretend that the weight he carried was not slowly crushing him into the ground, but never anything like this. He met her eyes, held them steady, let her see whatever she needed to see. If she was looking for a lie, she would not find one. If she was looking for hunger, for calculation, for the cold assessment of a man measuring what he could take, she would find none of that either. What she would find was a 43-year-old mountain man with blood on his face and grief in his chest and absolutely nothing left to pretend about. "No, ma'am," he said. "I am not here for that." The silence stretched between them. 5 seconds. 10. The canyon held its breath. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow passing across the sand between them like a clock hand measuring something that could not be measured. She searched his face one more time. Whatever she saw there, whatever combination of weariness and honesty and old pain she read in the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw, it made her lower the rock. Just slightly. Just enough. "My name is Clara Whitfield," she said. "They killed my brother 3 months ago. They have been hunting me ever since." She paused, drew a breath that shook only at the very end. "He found something. Daniel. My brother. Something worth more than lives. Worth more than mine." "What did he find?" She clutched the oilcloth bundle tighter against her chest and her eyes hardened. "Not yet. I do not know if I can trust you yet." The bruises on her wrist caught the light as she shifted her grip on the rock. 5 finger marks clear as a signature. Not from rope, from a hand. A man's hand pressing hard enough to leave its shape in her skin like a stamp of ownership. Elijah saw them. He did not ask. Not yet. Some questions had to wait until the person holding the answers was ready to open the door. "Fair enough," Elijah said. "But whoever is following you, they are close. How many? 3 at least, maybe more behind them. And if the ones behind them report back." She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. "Then we need to move." But before they could take a single step, the world cracked open. A rifle shot from the ridge above. The bullet kicked up dust 3 feet from Elijah, his boots close enough to feel the spray of sand against his shins. The sound rolled across the canyon like thunder, and before the echo died, a second shot followed. Closer. Move. Elijah grabbed Clara's arm and pulled her toward the canyon wall where the rock formed a natural overhang. More shots rained down from the ridge rapid, now less precise, but more desperate bullets ricocheting off stone and whining into the distance. The buckskin horse screamed. That terrible sound. The sound that haunts every person who has ever loved an animal, a sound of pure betrayed confusion, as if the horse could not understand why the world had suddenly become a place where pain came from nowhere and there was no way to run from it. Its front legs buckled. It went down hard, rolled onto its side, and lay still. Blood pooled beneath it, dark and spreading. 6 years. Gone in a heartbeat. Elijah shoved Clara behind the boulder, drew his Winchester, and returned fire in one continuous motion, muscle memory from 1,000 firefights overriding the part of his brain that wanted to grieve. One shot, controlled, aimed at the muzzle flash on the ridge. A man clutched his shoulder and tumbled backward out of sight, his rifle clattering down the rock face. 2 on the ridge, Elijah said, scanning the ridgeline with eyes that missed nothing. "Good positions. Professional. We are pinned." Clara crouched beside him, breathing hard but not panicking. The oilcloth bundle was still pressed against her body. The rock was still in her hand, and her voice when she spoke was as steady as his. "There is a mine shaft, 50 yards east, abandoned since the Comstock bust in '74. It connects to a tunnel system that comes out on the other side of the ridge." Elijah looked at her. "You know this country. My grandmother lived here. Agnes Whitfield. She came during the gold rush and never left, even when everyone else sold their land to the mining companies. She taught me every rock, every shadow, every place to hide in these mountains. She said a girl needed to know the escape routes before she ever needed to escape. That is how our people survived." Something shifted in Elijah's assessment of the woman beside him. She was not just running. She was navigating. She was not just surviving. She knew how. This was not a helpless girl in a ruined wedding dress. This was someone whose grandmother had poured a lifetime of hard-earned knowledge into her, and that knowledge was the reason she was still alive. "Cover fire," Elijah said. "Then we run. You lead." He rose, fired 3 shots at the ridge, fast controlled, aiming for muzzle flashes. A man screamed above them, the sound cutting off abruptly. Another body fell tumbling down the rock face and raising a cloud of dust that hung in the air like a curtain. Now. They ran. Clara led barefoot and bleeding, moving with a certainty that came from something deeper than memory, from blood, from bone, from a grandmother who had walked these canyons 1,000 times and passed that knowledge down like an inheritance more valuable than gold. 2 more shots chased them across the open wash. One kicked up sand at Elijah's feet. The other ricocheted off stone and whined into the distance like an angry hornet. But they made it. The mine shaft entrance gaped before them, a dark hole in the hillside, framed by timbers so rotten they looked like they might collapse at a touch. Blackness waited inside like an open mouth, and the smell of old earth and abandoned time drifted out of the darkness. Elijah turned and fired twice more at the ridge. The first shot hit rock. The second found flesh. A head shot at 200 yards. The man on the ridge jerked backward and disappeared behind the stones. Not bad for a mountain man running on adrenaline and old nightmares. One hunter left up there. But that one was smart, stayed behind cover, did not show himself, did not follow. He would be riding for reinforcements the moment they disappeared underground. Inside, Elijah said, "That last one will ride hard for help. We have a few hours, maybe less." They entered the darkness. The mine shaft smelled of dust and old timber and something deeper, something ancient, the smell of earth that had not seen sunlight in decades. The darkness was absolute. It swallowed them completely as they moved deeper, feeling their way along walls rough with the marks of abandoned picks and the memories of men who had come here chasing silver and found only stone and disappointment and slow death from bad air and cave-ins. Clara moved with certainty, even in the blackness. Her steps were sure, her breathing calm. She had been in this tunnel before. Her grandmother had brought her here as a girl, had taught her the turns and the drops and the places where the air grew thin and you needed to crouch low and breathe slow. This was her grandmother as country. The land remembered her blood. They walked for what felt like an hour, but was probably less. The only sounds were their footsteps, the drip of water somewhere far below, and the occasional creak of ancient timbers adjusting to weights and pressures that had been building for years. When they finally stopped to rest, sitting with their backs against cold stone in a chamber where the tunnel widened enough for two people to sit side by side, Clara began to speak. Not everything, not yet, but enough. "My brother was Daniel Whitfield, 28 years old, half scout, half guide. He knew these territories better than any living man. 3 months ago, he guided a group of travelers through the valley south of here. Rich men from San Francisco, well-dressed, carrying more gold than honest travelers should have been carrying." Her voice echoed softly in the darkness, and Elijah listened without interrupting. There was a rhythm to her telling, a careful parceling out of information, each piece given only when she was ready and not a moment before. Daniel saw something during that journey. Men moving stolen gold through a mining operation. Union Army gold stolen during the war and hidden for 15 years. Now being laundered through the Comstock lode mines and sent east as legitimate silver profits. She paused. "The man who owns the operation is Chester Poole." Elijah's blood went cold. Chester Poole. Everyone west of the Mississippi knew that name. One of the richest men in Nevada. Owner of half the Comstock lode. Connected to every dirty deal, every corrupt official, every body buried in desert ground where nobody would ever think to look. Daniel reported what he saw to the federal marshal in Carson City. Clara continued. "A man named William Cole," honest Daniel said, "one of the few." "What happened?" "A week later, 6 men came to our home. Daniel was standing in the doorway when they rode up. He never even had time to reach for his gun. They shot him where he stood. Left him bleeding on our mother's floor while I hid under the bed and watched the light leave his eyes." Her voice did not break. But Elijah heard the grief underneath it, solid and heavy as the stone they sat against. The kind of grief that does not crack the surface because it runs too deep. The kind that sits in the chest like a stone and stays there for years, for decades, for a lifetime if you let it. "Who sent them?" Elijah asked quietly. Clara said the name that changed everything. "A man named Marcus Denton. Chester Poole is right hand, the one who does all the dirty work." The silence in that tunnel was absolute. No wind, no dripping water, no creaking timber. Just darkness and stone, and 2 people breathing and the sound of a name hanging in the air between them like a blade. Elijah felt the world tilt beneath him, felt the ground shift under his hands, felt something click into place that had been waiting 2 years to connect, like the last tumbler in a lock that had been rusted shut, finally giving way. Marcus Denton, the man who killed Tommy Graves. The man Elijah had hunted across 3 territories until the hunting nearly killed him. The man who destroyed everything good in Elijah is life and walked away smiling. The same man, the same evil, the same unfinished business that had driven Elijah up a mountain and into 2 years of silence and solitude. His hand tightened around the stock of his rifle in the darkness. His knuckles went white. Clara noticed. She did not flinch. She had seen angry men before. The difference was that Elijah's anger was not pointed at her. She could feel that distinction in the dark, the way you can feel the difference between a fire that warms and a fire that burns. Same heat, different intent. "I know, Denton," Elijah said. His voice was low, almost not a voice at all, more like a growl that had been pressed flat by 2 years of silence. "He is the reason I live alone on a mountain. What did he do to you? Killed someone I loved. Same way he killed Daniel." The silence stretched between them again, but it was a different silence now. Not the wary silence of strangers measuring each other across a canyon. This was the silence of recognition. 2 people who had been walking separate roads through the same darkness and suddenly realized they were heading toward the same point. 2 strangers bound by the same enemy, the same grief, the same burning need for something that might be justice or might be revenge or might be something in between that did not have a name, because the human language had not yet invented a word precise enough to describe what it felt like to want a man dead and want him to answer for his crimes and want neither of those things to define you. "Then we do not run anymore," Clara said. "We fight." Elijah looked at her in the darkness, though he could not see her face. He could hear her voice, though, and there was no trembling in it. "Carson City," he said. 2 days' ride. We get the evidence to Marshal Cole. Denton will have men watching every trail. Then we do not take the trails." Clara's voice held a quiet authority that surprised him. "I know another way. Grandmother taught me. The paths that do not show on any map. The paths for people who do not want to be found." But they were not the only ones making plans that night. Meanwhile, 30 miles away, Marcus Denton stood on the porch of a ranch house that did not belong to him but might as well have. He smoked a cigar and listened to the report from the surviving hunter, a man with a bullet wound in his shoulder and fear in his eyes that no amount of bravado could conceal. "Stone killed 2 of your men?" Denton asked. His voice was calm, terrifyingly calm. He did not raise it, did not curse, did not slam his fist on the railing. That was what made Marcus Denton dangerous. Other men got loud when they were angry. Denton got quiet, and the quieter he got, the more people died. "He shoots faster than I remembered, sir." Denton drew on his cigar. Let the smoke curl upward into the evening air. "Stone." He said the name the way a man tastes something he has not eaten in a long time, testing whether it still had the old flavor. 2 years. I thought that fool died up on his mountain." He turned to the man leaning against the wall behind him. Flint Hargrove, 45 years old, gray eyes cold and flat as creek stones. The most dangerous gun hand between Texas and Oregon, a man whose reputation for killing was matched only by his reputation for silence. In 15 years of working for Marcus Denton, Flint Hargrove had never questioned an order, never hesitated, never shown anything that looked like doubt. "Flint, assemble the riders. The girl has her brother's journal. If that journal reaches Marshal Cole in Carson City, everything we have built comes apart." "Everything." Hargrove nodded. But as he turned to leave, his eyes passed over Denton with something that was not loyalty. Something else. Something Denton did not notice because he was too busy being the smartest man in the room to see what was happening right in front of him. But it was there, in the slight hesitation before the nod, in the way Hargrove's jaw tightened for just a fraction of a second, in the direction his gaze traveled, not toward the door, but toward the darkness outside, where 2 people he had never met were running for their lives through country that his boss intended to turn into their grave. It was the look of a man who had been standing on one side of a line for 15 years and was beginning to wonder for the first time what the ground felt like on the other side. Not trust. Not yet. trust was too big a word for what existed between a mountain man who had sworn off human connection and a runaway bride who had learned that every offered hand concealed a fist. What existed was smaller than trust, but perhaps more important. It was the beginning of the belief that maybe, just maybe, not every person in the world was looking for something to take. Clara had asked a question in that canyon, the hardest question anyone had ever asked Elijah Stone, and he had answered honestly. That was where it started, not with gunfire or heroics or some grand declaration, with a question and an answer and two people who had both been broken by the same world, choosing for reasons neither of them fully understood yet not to break each other. The trail ahead wound north through mountains that had no mercy and a desert that had no memory. Carson City waited somewhere beyond the heat and the dust and the danger, and with it the chance to finally hold Marcus Denton accountable for every drop of innocent blood he had ever spilled. But Elijah had not told Clara about Tommy yet, about the boy he had loved like a son, about the last words Tommy Graves ever spoke, the question that followed Elijah into every sleep and every waking. That story was coming, and when it came it would change everything between them. For now they rode north, two broken souls on stolen horses carrying evidence that could hang the most powerful men in Nevada, riding toward a city that was already preparing to kill them. And somewhere behind them, Flint Hargrove saddled his horse in the pre-dawn darkness and stared at the road ahead with gray eyes that held something new, something that looked, if you caught it in the right light, like the very first crack in a wall that had been solid for 15 years. He did not know yet what he would do when the moment came, but for the first time he knew that the moment was coming, and that when it arrived he would have to choose. They emerged from the tunnel system at dawn, blinking against the sudden assault of light after hours in the dark. The morning air hit them like cold water, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and juniper and the distant promise of snow on the Sierra Nevada peaks. For a moment they both stood still, two figures silhouetted against the pale sky, adjusting to a world that felt almost too bright and too open after the pressing closeness of stone. 3 miles to the nearest abandoned ranch, 2 days to Carson City. And somewhere behind them a survivor was riding hard in the wrong direction, carrying news that would bring more guns and more men and the kind of pursuit that did not end until someone stopped breathing. Elijah's shoulder had soaked through the makeshift bandage again. The blood had turned the cloth from white to rust brown to a deep red that was almost black, and each step sent fire down his arm in waves that pulsed with his heartbeat. The edges of his vision had started to blur that familiar dimming he remembered from Fredericksburg, when a mini-ball had taken a piece of his thigh and he had kept walking for 2 miles before his legs decided they were done. The body had limits. It told you about them whether you wanted to hear it or not. Clara saw it before he said a word. She saw the way his left hand had stopped swinging with his stride and had pressed itself flat against his side, unconsciously applying pressure. She saw the slight forward tilt of his shoulders, the posture of a man redistributing his weight to compensate for a part of himself that was failing. She had grown up on a ranch. She knew what wounded looked like, in horses, in cattle, in men. "Sit down," she said. It was not a request. It was the first time she had given him a direct order, and the fact that she felt capable of doing so said something about how the last 12 hours had shifted the ground between them. Elijah sat, not because he wanted to, because his body had already made the decision for him, and his legs were simply executing orders from a command center that had overridden his pride. Clara knelt beside him. She reached into the folds of her wedding dress, that ruined garment that had become less a dress and more a survival kit, and produced the small leather pouch she had carried since the beginning. From it she took dried sage leaves, wild ones, not the kind from a kitchen garden, but the tough silver-green variety that grew in the cracks between rocks at high altitude where nothing soft could survive, and yarrow root dried and ground to a fine powder the color of old bone. "Grandmother taught me," she said, as she peeled back the blood-soaked bandage with fingers that were steady despite their slight trembling. She knew every plant on these mountains, Which ones healed? Which ones killed? Which ones could do both depending on how you prepared them? She pressed the sage against the wound, first packing it tight into the groove the bullet had carved across the top of his shoulder. It stung like touching a hot stove, and Elijah's jaw clenched hard enough that he heard his own teeth grind. Then the yarrow powder dusted over the sage like snow over stone, and almost immediately the burning began to fade. The herbs drew the heat from the torn flesh, the way a cold creek pulls the fever from a horse's swollen leg. Elijah watched her work. The morning light fell across her face, catching the bruise along her jaw and the cut on her forearm that had scabbed over but still looked angry and red. Her hair was tangled and stiff with dust. The wedding dress was filthy torn, burned at the edges. She looked nothing like a bride. She looked like something fiercer, something the desert had tried to break and failed. And something happened that he did not expect. Something small. Something that in the context of a life lived at the margins of violence and loss should not have mattered, but mattered enormously. Her fingers touched his skin, and it was gentle. For the first time in 2 years, a human hand made contact with Elijah Stone's body, not to cause pain, but to relieve it. The simple warmth of another person is touch offered freely, without agenda, without expectation, without the transaction that he had come to believe was hidden inside every human interaction. Just a hand on a wound. Just someone trying to help someone else hurt less. He did not know how to respond. He had forgotten the protocol. So he sat very still and said nothing. And that silence, the silence of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be cared for and did not trust himself to speak because he was afraid of what his voice might reveal, said more than any sentence could have constructed. Clara noticed something. When her fingers pressed against his shoulder, Elijah did not flinch away. But his jaw tightened. Not from the pain. She had dressed enough wounds on enough animals and enough people to know the difference between a man reacting to physical hurt and a man reacting to something else entirely. This was the second kind. This was a man clenching his teeth against the impulse to let this moment mean something, because things that meant something could be lost, and he had no more room in his chest for loss. She finished the bandage, set the remaining herbs on the ground beside him, rather than placing them directly into his hand. He picked them up himself a moment later when he was ready. The distance between those two actions, between her setting down and his picking up, was perhaps 6 inches of dusty ground. But in the language of two people who had both been hurt by hands that reached too fast and grabbed too hard, that 6 inches was a cathedral of respect. They found horses at an abandoned ranch 2 miles east. The corral fence was half collapsed, the house had lost its roof to wind and time, and the barn leaned at an angle that suggested it was having a long argument with gravity and losing. But 3 horses remained in the lower pasture, gone half wild from months without human contact, but still wearing the marks of bridle and saddle on their coats. Elijah caught a big dark gelding, calm and strong, the kind of horse that would not panic when gunfire started, because it had been around enough of life to know that panic solved nothing. Clara caught a spotted mare, smaller but quick-footed with intelligent eyes, that assessed her new rider with the same careful judgment Clara herself applied to every new situation. They rode north, hard, through country that would kill anyone who did not know its secrets. Clara knew its secrets. She navigated by landmarks her grandmother had named half a century ago. The rock that looked like a sleeping bear, the creek bed that ran water only in March and April, the stand of ancient junipers that marked an underground spring where horses could drink even in the driest months. Which canyons had water pooling in their deepest shadows? Which passes were blocked by spring rock slides, and which had been scoured clean by flash floods? Which routes wound north toward Carson City without ever crossing the main trails where Denton's men would be watching with rifles and patience and orders to kill? She led. Elijah followed. And the simple fact of that arrangement, the mountain man following the young woman in the torn wedding dress through country she knew better than he did, said something important about who Clara Whitfield was becoming, or perhaps about who she had always been underneath the expectations that had been piled on her by a father who saw a daughter as currency and a world that saw a woman as property. The afternoon passed in hard riding and shared silence. They stopped once at a seep spring that Clara knew, where water trickled from a crack in red sandstone and pooled in a basin the size of a washtub. They drank. The horses drank. They did not speak. Some silences between people are empty. Others are full. This one was the second kind, filled with everything that had happened in the last day, and everything that was coming, and the growing awareness not yet spoken, not yet named, that whatever connected them was becoming harder to ignore. By evening they had covered nearly 30 miles. The main trail was 5 miles to the east, visible occasionally as a pale ribbon cutting through the brown hills. Dust rose from it twice during the afternoon. Riders moving fast. Denton, his men heading north to Carson City ahead of them, carrying orders and guns, and the assumption that the prey was still alive and still moving. That night they sheltered in a small cave that Clara found in a fold of the hills, invisible from more than 20 feet away. Elijah built a fire so small it was barely more than a handful of embers, enough heat to push back the chill of the desert night, but not enough light to be seen from the ridgeline above. The horses stood hobbled outside their breath, making small clouds in the cold air. They sat on opposite sides of the fire. Clara's face was half lit by the orange glow, half lost in shadow. The wedding dress looked like a ghost, his garment in the dim light, something from another life, another world, another version of Clara Whitfield who no longer existed and could never exist again. The silence stretched. The fire popped once, sending a tiny spray of sparks upward into the dark, and then Clara spoke. "The man you lost. Tell me about him." Elijah did not respond for a long time. The embers shifted. A coyote called somewhere in the distance, its voice thin and lonesome, the sound the desert made when it was talking to itself. He stared into the fire with eyes that were seeing something else entirely, something 2,200 miles and 2 years away. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than she had heard it before. Quieter, as if the words were coming from a room deep inside him that had been locked shut for a very long time, and the hinges were rusted, and the door did not want to open. His name was Tommy Graves. He said the name the way you handle something fragile, carefully, with both hands. I found him on a ranch in Texas when he was 17, orphaned, hungry, sleeping in a barn because he had nowhere else on this earth to go, and the barn at least had a roof, and the horses did not judge him for having nothing. I saw something in that boy, something that reminded me of who I was before the war burned it out of me, before Antietam, before I learned what a man looks like when the shell hits 3 feet to his left and the concussion turns his insides to soup, before I learned that the world was not the place I had been promised. He paused, drew a breath. The fire crackled softly between them. So I took him on, taught him everything. How to break a wild horse without breaking its spirit. How to read tracks in dirt so dry it crumbled at a touch. How to shoot straight and work hard and look a man in the eye when you shook his hand. He stopped again. And when he continued, something in his voice had shifted. Something softer had crept in despite his efforts to keep it out, like water finding its way through a crack in a dam. Tommy made the worst coffee I have ever tasted in my life, every single morning for 5 years, boiled it until it was thick as mud and bitter enough to strip paint, and every single morning he would hand me that cup with this smile on his face, this big open smile, like he had just given me the greatest gift any man had ever received, and I would drink it, every drop, and I never said a word, because that smile was worth more than good coffee. That smile was worth more than anything. Clara said nothing. She listened, and her silence was not empty. It was the silence of someone who understood that the most respectful thing you can offer another person is pain, is the space to exist without being rushed or fixed or explained away. Sometimes silence is the only container large enough to hold grief. He called me Mr. Elijah, always formal, always respectful. But the bond between us went deeper than titles. We were not father and son by blood. We were something else. Something built from shared work and quiet evenings by the fire and the slow accumulation of trust that comes from watching a person keep their word day after day until keeping their word is not something they do, but something they are. Marcus Denton, Clara said quietly. Elijah nodded in the firelight. Denton was foreman at the Double R Ranch, former Confederate officer out of Georgia. Smooth-talking, well-dressed, the kind of man who smiled while he slid a knife between your ribs and made you feel grateful for the attention. I discovered he was stealing cattle, skimming profits, running a whole criminal operation under the owner's nose, rustling stock, selling it across the border, intimidating smaller ranchers into surrendering their land. I reported it, stood up in court, testified with a dozen witnesses backing my word, and he walked free. Elijah's voice was flat when he said it. Not angry, past angry. In the territory beyond anger, where the landscape is gray and featureless, and the only thing left is a kind of exhausted clarity. Corrupt sheriff filed the paperwork wrong. Evidence disappeared from a locked room. Legal technicalities that turned justice into a joke told by rich men in wood-paneled offices while they drank brandy paid for with stolen money. He stopped, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone very quiet. 1 week after the trial collapsed, Denton's gang ambushed Tommy on a supply run. 5 men against 1 boy on an empty road 5 miles from town. The fire between them had burned down to its lowest point, just embers now glowing red and orange in the dark, barely enough light to see each other's faces. But Clara could see his eyes. And what she saw there was not rage or self-pity or the theatrical grief that some men perform to elicit sympathy. What she saw was a wound, open, still bleeding after 2 years. The kind of wound that time does not heal because time does not know where to start. I found him in the dirt. 3 bullets in his chest, blood on his lips, eyes already going glassy, but still looking, still searching, still hoping that someone was coming. Elijah's voice broke, just once. A single fracture in the wall he had spent 2 years building, a crack so brief that if Clara had blinked, she would have missed it. Then it was solid again, rebuilt in an instant, the way a man who has survived war and loss and the death of everything he loved learns to rebuild his walls faster and stronger each time they fall. He said something to me before he died. Tommy, a question. I hear that question every single night before I sleep and every single morning when I wake up. What question? Elijah looked at her across the dying fire. And for a moment, just a moment, she saw the mountain man, his armor come completely down. Saw the person underneath. Not the rifleman, not the survivor, not the man who could shoot a target at 200 yards while running for his life. Just a 43-year-old human being carrying a weight that would have broken most people a long time ago. Not yet, he said. When the time comes, you will hear it. The fire popped. A log shifted. Sparks rose into the dark sky like tiny orange stars looking for a place to land. Clara was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that surprised both of them. Daniel was the same. My brother. He believed that telling the truth was enough, that the system would protect him, that justice existed, that good people won in the end. She gave a small laugh, quiet and bitter, the sound of a lesson learned at too high a price. He was wrong, maybe Elijah said, but maybe we are trying to prove them right. The words hung in the air between them, fragile as the sparks from the fire, carrying more weight than either of them was ready to fully acknowledge, because that was exactly what they were doing. Riding toward Carson City with evidence that could destroy the most powerful men in Nevada, not because they wanted revenge, though they did, and not because they wanted justice, though they did, but because 2 young men who had believed in goodness had died for that belief, and letting their deaths mean nothing was worse than any bullet or any fire or any desert. Clara shifted closer to the embers. Not much, perhaps 6 inches. Her shoulder was near his now, not touching, but close enough that either of them could have closed the distance with the smallest movement. Neither did. But the 6 inches that remained between them was smaller than any distance Clara had allowed between herself and another person in 3 months. and that in the language of people who have been hurt by closeness was everything. Morning came gray and cold. They rode before full light, pushing the horses hard across terrain that grew rougher as they climbed toward the Carson River Valley. The mountains rose on either side like walls, channeling them toward a crossing that Clara said was the only option that would keep them off the main trails. By midday, they heard it before they saw it. A low roar that built as they descended through a narrow canyon, growing louder with each switchback until it filled the air like continuous thunder. Spring snowmelt from the Sierra Nevada had turned the Carson River into something biblical. 60 yards wide, gray-green water running fast and cold, carrying branches and debris and the occasional uprooted tree that tumbled past in the current like a battering ram looking for something to destroy. The normal ford was completely underwater, gone, erased by a volume of water that would not recede for weeks. "We cross here. We arrive 8 hours ahead of the next ford," Elijah said, his eyes measuring the water, calculating the current, assessing the risk with the automatic precision of a man who had been calculating risks since he was 20 years old and standing in a field at Antietam, wondering whether the next volley would be the one that found him. "We go around Denton, as men catch us on the open trail. Not a question of if, a question of when." Clara studied the river. Something shifted in her eyes. Memory, perhaps. Or the echo of a grandmother, his voice explaining something important in the patient tone of a woman who knew that knowledge passed down was the most valuable inheritance a person could leave. "There is a gravel bar upstream, half a mile. Shallower water. My grandmother used to cross there when the spring floods came. Said it was the only place where the river bottom was solid enough to hold a horse's weight. They found it. A stretch where the river widened and the current slowed slightly, running over a bed of packed gravel that showed as a lighter band beneath the murky surface. It was still dangerous. The water was waist-deep at the shallowest point and moving fast enough to push a standing man off his feet. But it was crossable. Barely. They entered the river at the upstream edge of the gravel bar. The horses fought the current immediately, their hooves scrambling for purchase on the shifting stones beneath. Water rose to the stirrups, then to the saddle, then higher still cold, seeping through clothes and into bone-pulling heat from the body with the greedy efficiency of something alive and hungry. Halfway across, with the far bank tantalizingly close, the spotted mare stumbled. Her front hoof found not gravel, but a gap between stones, and she lurched sideways with a sound of pure equine panic, her body tilting at an angle that physics would not forgive. Clara fell. She went sideways into the churning water, and the current took her immediately, snatching her from the horse's back with the casual violence of a hand sweeping crumbs from a table. One moment she was there. The next, she was 10 feet downstream and moving fast, arms flailing, head going under in the gray-green water surfacing, going under again. Elijah did not think, did not calculate, did not weigh the risks or consider the odds or wonder whether this was the wise course of action. There was no time for wisdom. There was only the sight of a dark head bobbing in white water and the sound of a voice cutting off mid-cry as the river pushed her under again. He kicked free of his stirrups and dove. The cold hit like a fist to the center of his chest. It drove the air from his lungs in a single explosive gasp and replaced it with a shock so total that for one terrible second his body simply refused to function. The current grabbed him, tumbled him, dragged him under, spun him in the gray-green dark, until he did not know which direction was up and which was down, and the only thing that kept him oriented was the knowledge that the surface was wherever the light was. He broke through, gasped, saw Clara 15 feet ahead, her dark hair streaming in the current, one arm reaching for something to grab and finding nothing. She went under again. He swam harder than he had ever swum in his life, harder than the river crossing at Fredericksburg when Confederate sharpshooters were picking off men in the water and the Rappahannock ran red for a quarter-mile downstream. His arms cut through the current in strokes powered by desperation and something else, something that felt like purpose, like the reason he had climbed down from his ridge in the first place. His hand caught her arm, lost it, The river tore them apart with the indifferent cruelty of moving water that does not care about human intentions or human lives, or the fragile connections that form between people who have nothing left but each other. He reached again, further this time. His fingers closed around her forearm. Held. The current tried to pull her free, tried to separate them, tried to reduce them back to two individual pieces of debris tumbling toward wherever the river decided to deposit them. Elijah held on. His grip was not gentle. Gentleness would have gotten them both killed. It was the grip of a man who had lost too many people and would not lose one more, not today, not this way, not in this river. He pulled her close, wrapped his arm around her chest from behind, the way he had been taught to rescue a drowning man at the Rappahannock, and fought toward the far bank, with legs that were going numb, and lungs that were burning, and a shoulder wound that had reopened and was adding its own red thread to the gray-green water. His feet found something solid. Shallower water. Gravel giving way to mud, giving way to the blessed solidity of a bank that was not moving. He dragged them both up onto the shore, crawling the last few feet on hands and knees because his legs had given out, and willpower was the only thing left in the tank. They collapsed in the mud, coughing, shaking, bodies racked with cold so deep it felt like the marrow of their bones had turned to ice. Clara lay on her back chest, heaving water streaming from her hair and her ruined wedding dress. Her lips were blue, her eyes were wide, but she was breathing. She turned her head to look at him, those blue-gray eyes bright with cold and shock, and something else that he could not name. "You could have let me drown," she said. "Saved yourself." "Not how I am built." And there it was, the same answer he had given in the canyon when she asked if he only wanted her body. Simple, direct, true. Not a grand declaration or a heroic speech or the kind of performative nobility that men use to impress women with their virtue. Just a statement of fact from a man who had been stripped down to his essentials by 2 years of solitude and had nothing left but the truth. Clara looked at him for a long moment. The water dripped from her face. Her breathing steadied, and she called him something different. "Thank you," she said. "Not Mister, not Sir, no formal distance. Just 2 words spoken plainly by a woman who had spent 3 months learning that gratitude was dangerous because it implied trust, and trust implied vulnerability, and vulnerability got you killed. But she said it anyway. From across the river a voice carried through the morning air, clear and mocking and immediately recognizable as the voice of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Stone." Elijah looked up, still gasping for breath, still dripping river water, still feeling the cold in his bones. On the far bank, mounted on a tall black horse with the ease of a man who had been in the saddle since before he could walk, sat Flint Hargrove, 45 years old, gray eyes flat as creek stones. 4 men flanked him, rifles resting across their saddles, with the casual readiness of men who used guns the way most people used forks. Denton rode ahead to Carson City. Hargrove called across the water. His voice carried clearly despite the roar of the river between them. "He is waiting for you there, knows you are coming, knows what you are carrying." Elijah said nothing, just stared back across the churning water at the man on the black horse. River between them, no way to shoot, no way to fight, just 2 men looking at each other across a divide that was more than water. Hargrove smiled. But it was a strange smile, not the smile of a predator savoring the kill. Something else. Something Elijah filed away for later because he did not have the energy or the context to understand it yet. He owns half the town's stone. The sheriff, the judge, half the deputies. You walk into Carson City, you do not walk out. The riders turned north, following the river road at an easy pace, not chasing, not hurrying, because the trap was already set and the prey was already walking into it, and there was no need to rush what time and geography would accomplish on their own. Clara watched them go. The water was still dripping from her hair, and her body was still shaking with cold, but her eyes were steady. "He is right," she said. "If Denton controls the town, walking in openly is death." Elijah wrung water from his hat, put it back on his head, looked north toward Carson City, and the mountains beyond, and the faint smear of smoke on the horizon that marked the edge of civilization. Then we do not walk in openly. We find another way. But he noticed something as the riders disappeared around a bend in the river road. Something about Hargrove. When the gun hand turned his horse, he looked back at Elijah one more time. Just a glance. Brief. Almost involuntary. And in that glance there was no hatred, no contempt, no bloodlust. What Elijah saw in the fraction of a second before Hargrove's face became a mask again was exhaustion. The deep bone-level exhaustion of a man who has been doing something for a very long time and has run out of reasons to keep doing it. He filed that away too. It might mean nothing. It might mean everything. That same evening, in an office paneled with dark oak on the second floor of the Comstock Hotel in Carson City, Marcus Denton poured 2 glasses of brandy and handed one to Chester Poole. Poole's hand shook when he took it. Brandy sloshed over the rim and ran between his fat fingers. "The journal," he said. "If that journal reaches Cole, my name is on every page. My name, my accounts, my signature on transfer documents. They will hang me Marcus." Denton sipped his brandy with the calm of a man discussing the weather. "It will not reach him. You said they were dead. The house burned. But now Hargrove says Stone is alive. Says the girl survived the river. How many times do we have to kill these people before they stay dead?" Denton set his glass down. Looked at Poole with eyes that held no warmth and no patience. "Stone is dangerous," he said. "But he has a weakness. He cares. About the girl. About justice. About doing the right thing. Caring is a leash, Chester. And leashes can be used to drag a man exactly where you want him." Outside the office door, Flint Hargrove stood in the hallway. He had come to deliver a report, but his hand stayed raised knuckles an inch from the wood frozen. He had heard every word. And for the first time in 15 years, the weight of what he carried felt heavier than the paycheck that was supposed to make it bearable. That night they sheltered in an adobe homestead tucked into a fold of the hills. The walls still stood thick and solid, though the roof had partially collapsed, and the windows were dark, empty squares open to the night air. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold now, the hearth filled with the ashes of fires that had burned out years ago. "My grandmother is summer home," Clara said. Her voice went soft with memory, the way a person's voice changes when they are touching something sacred. She refused to leave when everyone else sold their land to the mining companies. Said this earth was in her blood, that she would rather die on ground she knew than live on ground that did not know her. They let her stay. Too old to be worth the trouble of forcing, they said. Too stubborn, she said. Clara ran her hand along the adobe wall, her fingers tracing lines and cracks that mapped decades of sun and wind and the patient erosion of time. Agnes Whitfield had built this place with her own hands. Mixed, the mud laid the bricks, set the timbers. It had sheltered her through summers that could crack stone and winters that could freeze the marrow. She taught me everything. Clara continued, settling beside the cold fireplace as Elijah stood at the window, eyes scanning the darkness outside with the tireless vigilance of a man who had learned that safety was an illusion, and the only real defense was never stopping watching. How to read tracks. How to find water where there should not be any. Which plants heal, and which ones kill, and which ones do both depending on how you use them. She said a girl needed to know more than a boy did, because the world would not protect a girl the way it protected a boy. A girl had to protect herself. Elijah listened. He was learning that Clara, his grandmother, was not just a memory. She was a presence, a force that had shaped Clara the way wind shapes stone, slowly, relentlessly, until the shape that remained was the shape that could survive anything. Clara's voice changed, went colder, harder, the way water changes when the temperature drops below freezing, same substance, different state. My father did not listen to grandmother. He thought a daughter only needed to know how to cook and sew and be pleasant to the right people at the right times. When the debts came, when the bank threatened to take the ranch, father looked at what he had left and calculated. The cattle were sold. The equipment was mortgaged. The land was leveraged to its limit. The only thing of value left was me. She said it without self-pity, without drama. Just the plain facts of a transaction stated the way you might describe the sale of a horse or a piece of furniture, because that was exactly how her father had treated it. Chester Poole, 55 years old, fat, sweating always even in winter, the richest man in Nevada. He offered to erase the family debt every penny in exchange for one thing: a bride. Elijah turned from the window. His face was unreadable in the darkness, but his hands hanging at his sides had curled into fists. My parents agreed. I was dressed in white and told it was an honor. Her fingers found the scar on the back of her right hand, fresh, still pink. She traced it absently while she spoke the way a person touches a wound to remind themselves that it happened, that it was real, that they survived it. The night before the wedding, Poole came to my room, said he wanted to inspect what he was buying before the transaction was finalized. My father stood outside the door and did nothing. The silence that followed was the loudest sound in the room, louder than the wind outside, louder than the creak of the old timbers settling. It was a silence that contained an entire world of violation and betrayal. The sound of a father choosing money over his daughter is safety. The sound of a system that allowed it, the sound of everything wrong with the world distilled into one dark room and one closed door. "What did you do?" Elijah asked. His voice was quiet, dangerously quiet. I stabbed him with my sewing scissors. Clara held up her hand, showing the scar. Not deep enough to do real damage, but deep enough to make him pull back, deep enough to buy me a night. She lowered her hand, but I knew that after the wedding there would be no scissors sharp enough to save me. After the wedding, I would belong to him, legally, completely, and the law that was supposed to protect people would be the same law that delivered me to his bed. So she ran. The night before her wedding, wearing the dress, because it was the only clothing she had access to in the room they had locked her in, she climbed through a window, dropped 8 feet to the ground, and ran barefoot into the Nevada darkness. But before she ran, she pried up a floorboard in Daniel's old room and retrieved the one thing her brother had left behind: the oilcloth-wrapped journal that contained enough evidence to destroy Chester Poole and Marcus Denton and every corrupt official who had protected them for 15 years. 3 days. No sleep, no food, no water until she found a seep spring on the 2nd day. Running through desert and rock and sagebrush in a wedding dress and bare feet with hired killers behind her and no one in front of her and nothing to sustain her except the knowledge that her brother had died for the truth and she would not let the truth die with her. Then came the pause, the real one, the moment where the conversation shifted from information to something deeper. "I am afraid," Elijah said. Clara looked at him, surprised. It was perhaps the last thing she expected to hear from the mountain man who had killed 3 men in a canyon and dove into a flooding river without hesitation and fired a rifle with the cold precision of someone who had left fear behind a long time ago. Afraid of what? Afraid that I am doing all of this not for justice, but because I want to kill Denton, because I want to watch the light leave his eyes the way it left Tommy's eyes, the way it left Daniel's eyes. And if that is the real reason, then I am not different from him. I am just another man with a gun and a grudge who has convinced himself that his violence is righteous. The fire was dead between them, just cold ash. But the words hung in the air with a heat of their own, and Clara studied them the way she had studied his face in the canyon, looking for the lie, looking for the performance. She found neither. "You are different," she said, "because you are afraid of becoming him. He is never afraid of that. He does not even see the question. That is the difference between a man with a conscience and a man without one. The man with a conscience asks the question. The man without one does not know there is a question to ask." Elijah looked at her across the space between them. The adobe walls held the cold of the night, and the stars through the broken roof were so bright and so many that they seemed to be pressing down, leaning in, trying to hear what these two people were saying to each other in the dark. Clara shifted, moved closer to him by perhaps 6 inches. Her shoulder was near his now. close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body despite the cold night air. Not touching. But not far. The closest she had voluntarily placed herself to another human being since the night she climbed through that window and dropped into the darkness. It was a small movement. It would have been invisible to anyone watching from a distance. But in the geography of two people who had both been damaged by closeness, who had both learned that proximity to another person usually preceded pain, that 6 inches of close distance was an act of extraordinary courage. Neither of them mentioned it. Some things do not need to be spoken to be heard. Midnight came without warning. Glass shattered. A torch flew through the window, trailing flame and smoke, and the acrid smell of kerosene-soaked rags. It landed on the wooden floor where the roof had leaked enough to leave dry timber exposed, and the fire caught immediately. Hungry. Bright. Spreading across the floor with a speed that turned seconds into the only currency that mattered. Elijah grabbed his rifle. Through the smoke and the growing heat he counted silhouettes outside. 4 men, surrounding the house. Reinforcements that the survivor from the canyon had summoned, riding hard through the night to reach them. Stone. A voice from outside, confident, unhurried, the voice of a man who believes the story is already over, and he is just reading the last paragraph. Send out the woman and the journal. You can walk away. Last chance. Clara's voice came before Elijah could respond, clear and sharp and carrying a heat that had nothing to do with the fire spreading across the floor. Nobody is handing over anybody. Elijah glanced at her. She stood in the smoke and the growing firelight with her jaw set, and her eyes burning, and her hands clenched at her sides, and there was nothing in her posture that resembled the terrified girl pressed against a canyon wall 12 hours ago. That girl was gone. In her place stood something that the desert and the river and the tunnel and the long dark night of shared confession had forged into something new, something that would not be traded or taken or given away. Elijah fired through the window. A man outside grunted and fell. Return fire tore through the adobe walls, sending chunks of dried mud flying like shrapnel. The fire was spreading faster now, climbing the walls, reaching for the remaining roof timbers, filling the room with smoke so thick it turned breathing into a conscious effort. Trapped, Elijah said. Clara moved to the fireplace, knelt. Her hands found the loose stones at the base with the certainty of someone who had been shown this exact spot by a grandmother who believed in preparation the way other people believed in prayer. She pulled the stones aside one by one, methodical, unhurried, despite the flames closing in behind her. A dark opening appeared, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. Cold air breathed up from below, the smell of earth and stone and underground water. Grandmother built this, Clara said. Always have an escape route. That is what she taught me. That is how you survive in a world that is always trying to trap you. They crawled into the darkness, stone pressing close on all sides, the sound of flames and shouting fading behind them with each foot of distance gained, replaced by the close silence of underground. Clara led. Elijah followed. His shoulder scraped the tunnel walls and left blood on stone that had been dry for decades. They emerged behind a tumble of boulders just as the roof of the adobe house collapsed in a shower of sparks and flame. The men outside stood watching the fire, their faces lit by the blaze, convinced their targets were burning inside, already thinking about the reward they would collect, already planning how they would spend it, not bothering to check the perimeter because dead people do not crawl out of burning buildings and the living are too busy celebrating to look behind the rocks. Clara and Elijah disappeared into the night, alive again, but changed by the fire in ways that went beyond the soot on their skin and the smoke in their lungs. They stopped an hour later on a hillside above the burning homestead. The fire was a distant orange glow behind them, and ahead, invisible in the darkness, but waiting like a held breath, lay Carson City and everything it contained. The law, the enemy, the chance. Clara sat down, reached inside her dress, and pulled out something that made Elijah stop breathing for 3 full seconds. Not just the oilcloth journal, something else. Folded papers, thin, the kind used for official documents, held flat against her skin by strips of fabric torn from the inside of the wedding dress. "There is something I have not told you," she said. Elijah waited. Daniel did not just write a journal. He made copies of bank documents. Chester Poole's actual signature on contracts authorizing the gold transfers, dates, amounts, account numbers at banks in San Francisco. Daniel hid the copies separately from the journal under a different floorboard because he said you never put all your evidence in one place. She held out the papers. In the starlight, Elijah could see faint lines of ink, official stamps, a signature he did not recognize, but that Marshall Cole would. "I sewed them into the lining of my wedding dress, the dress Poole bought for me. His money paid for the fabric that is carrying the evidence that will destroy him." There was something in her voice when she said that. Not satisfaction exactly. Something harder and colder and more precise. The voice of a woman who understood irony at a molecular level, because irony was the only weapon the powerless had against the powerful, and she had learned to wield it like a blade. "You kept this hidden the whole way," Elijah said. "Through the canyon, through the tunnel, through the river. I did not know if I could trust you." She met his eyes in the starlight. "Now I do." She placed the papers in his hand, and as she did, her fingers rested on his forearm. Just for a moment. Light, brief, but deliberate, not accidental, not the incidental contact of hands passing an object. This was a choice. She was saying, "I trust you," in the language of touch, which for a woman who had been grabbed and grasped and clutched without consent for as long as she could remember, was the bravest sentence she had ever spoken. Elijah felt the warmth of her fingers on his skin. He did not pull away. He did not lean in. He held perfectly still and let the moment be exactly what it was, a young woman deciding for herself who she allowed to be close and choosing him. Not because he had saved her, though he had. Not because he was strong, though he was. But because he had answered her question honestly in a canyon when every other man she had known would have lied. The moment passed. Her hand withdrew, but the warmth stayed on his skin like a brand that did not burn, and he knew that something between them had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Now they had two sets of evidence, the journal and the bank documents. Even if one was lost, the other would be enough. Poole's signature on federal gold transfer contracts was the kind of evidence that did not require interpretation or testimony or a sympathetic jury. It was the kind of evidence that spoke for itself in the universal language of guilt. Before dawn, they stood on a ridge overlooking Carson City. The town spread below them in the gray pre-dawn light, a grid of streets and buildings, and the tall steeple of the Methodist church catching the first pale touch of morning. Smoke rose from chimneys. The distant sound of church bells carried up the hillside, calling the faithful and the faithless alike. "Do you think we will survive this?" Clara asked. "I do not know." She almost smiled. "Honest. I like that about you. You do not lie to make me feel better." "You want me to lie?" "No. I have heard enough lies for a lifetime." She turned to look at him. "Whatever happens today, thank you, for being the first person who answered me truthfully." Elijah nodded, said nothing. Sometimes silence was the most truthful answer of all. Clara reached down and tore the lower section of her wedding dress away. The ragged, burned, mud-stained fabric came free in a long strip. She used part of it to wrap the handle of the small knife Elijah had given her in the tunnel, making the grip secure. She used another part to bind the journal and bank documents tight against her body under her remaining clothes. She tucked the knife into her sleeve where it would be invisible but accessible in less than a second. "If you fall," she said, straightening up and meeting his eyes with a steadiness that had not been there 2 days ago, "I still deliver the evidence to Marshall Cole. Daniel did not die for nothing." She said it like a fact, like the direction of the wind or the color of the sky, something that simply was. And Elijah understood in that moment that Clara Whitfield was no longer running from something. She was running toward something, and she would get there with or without him, because that was who she had become in the crucible of the last 3 days. They started down the hill toward Carson City. Two people covered in dust and dried blood, carrying evidence that could topple the most powerful men in Nevada, walking into a town that was controlled by their enemy and rigged to kill them. And inside the Methodist Church, where 200 of Carson City's finest citizens were gathering for Sunday morning services, Marcus Denton sat in the front pew beside Chester Poole. Denton wore a suit that cost more than most men earned in a year. His gray hair was neatly combed. His boots were polished. The image of a respectable businessman, a pillar of the community, a generous donor to the church building fund. Poole sat beside him, fat, sweating, eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. "They are dead," Denton murmured, leaning close. His voice was barely audible above the opening hymn. The house burned to the ground, 4 men confirmed. Poole mopped his forehead with a silk handkerchief. "You are certain?" Denton smiled. That cold smile, the one that never reached his eyes, the smile of a man who had been winning for so long he had forgotten what the first taste of defeat felt like. Completely certain. In the back pew, Flint Hargrove sat alone. His gray eyes were not on the minister, not on the hymnals, not on the stained glass windows or the flickering candles, or the good people of Carson City performing their weekly ritual of faith and community. His eyes were on the door. He was waiting. He did not know what for. But something in the part of him that had been silent for 15 years, the part that remembered a time before Denton, before the killing, before the slow erasure of everything that had once made him recognizable to himself, that part was awake now. It was awake, and it was watching the door, and it was waiting for something that it could not name but would recognize the moment it arrived. The hymn rose. 200 voices singing about mercy and redemption and the forgiveness of sins. And outside, 2 figures moved through the back streets of Carson City, covered in dust and river mud and the ashes of a burned house, heading toward the church where the truth was about to walk through the front door and tear the mask off the face of evil in front of everyone who had ever believed its smile. The morning sun cleared the mountains. The church bells rang, and Elijah Stone checked his Colt one final time. 6 rounds. Fully loaded. It was enough. It would have to be. Beside him, Clara Whitfield straightened her spine, squared her shoulders, lifted her chin. She was 22 years old, barefoot, wearing the ruins of a wedding dress that had been bought to deliver her into the hands of a man who saw her as property, and she was about to walk into a room full of people who would either save her life or watch her die. She was not afraid. She had been afraid before. In the canyon, in the river, in the burning house. Fear was familiar to her, intimate as a scar. But somewhere between the tunnel and the river and the fire and the long dark night of truth-telling and a dead woman, his house fear had used up its power over her. It had thrown everything it had, and she was still standing, still walking, still carrying her brother as evidence against her body, like armor made of paper and ink, and a dead man as careful handwriting. "We go in together," Clara said. Together, Elijah agreed. They walked toward the church. The bells were still ringing. The hymn was reaching its final verse. And inside, a man who had killed and stolen and lied for 15 years was sitting in the front pew with his hands folded and his eyes closed, pretending to pray to a God whose commandments he had broken so many times that the breaking had become a kind of prayer of its own. He did not know what was coming, but it was here, and it would not knock. It would kick the door open and walk in carrying the truth. May Sullivan had red hair going gray at the temples and hands that were permanently rough from lye soap and hot water. She ran the laundry at the eastern edge of Carson City, a small wooden building with steam rising from its roof 6 days a week and the smell of clean cotton drifting into the street like a promise that some things in the world could still be made fresh again. 3 years ago, a group of men had tried to burn that building to the ground. Said Irish were not welcome in Carson City. Said a woman had no business running an operation on Main Street. Said a lot of things that men say when they are afraid of someone smaller than them doing something better than they can. They came at night with torches and kerosene and the particular courage that comes from numbers and darkness, and the knowledge that nobody in this town would stop them. Daniel Whitfield stopped them. He had been passing through town on a scouting job. He did not know May Sullivan, had never spoken to her, had no reason to involve himself in a dispute that was not his in a town that was not his for a woman whose name he had never heard. But he saw the torches, saw the men, saw the small, red-headed woman standing in the doorway of her business with a bucket of water in one hand and terror in her eyes and the absolute certainty that she was about to lose everything she had spent 10 years building. Daniel walked into the middle of it, unarmed, told the men to go home. When they did not, he stood between them and the building and took the first punch and the second punch and did not go down and did not stop talking and did not leave until the sheriff arrived and the men scattered like roaches in sudden light. May Sullivan owed Daniel Whitfield her life, and May Sullivan was the kind of person who paid her debts. She opened the back door of the laundry before Elijah finished knocking. Her eyes moved from his face to the blood on his shirt, to the rifle in his hand, to the young woman standing behind him in the ruins of a wedding dress, and she processed all of it in approximately 2 seconds with the efficiency of a woman who had survived the Irish famine as a child and learned early that hesitation was a luxury only the comfortable could afford. Inside. Now. Quick. The back room of the laundry smelled of soap and steam and the faint sweetness of starch. Clean linens hung from ceiling lines, creating a maze of white fabric that turned the space into something cathedral-like, quiet and hidden and separate from the world outside. May moved through the hanging sheets with practiced speed, pulling down a clean shirt for Elijah, producing a basin of warm water and fresh bandages, setting out bread and cold beef and a pot of coffee that was already brewed and waiting as if she had known they were coming. Denton arrived yesterday, May said, speaking quickly while Clara ate, and Elijah let May rebandage his shoulder with the brisk competence of a woman who had raised 4 sons and patched up more wounds than she could count. He and Chester Poole are attending Sunday service at the Methodist Church this morning, playing respectable businessmen, pillars of the community, God-fearing men with clean hands and generous hearts. The bitterness in her voice could have stripped paint. Marshall Cole is staying at the Grand Hotel. Good man, honest from what I can see. But Denton has men everywhere. 6 that I have counted, probably more that I have not. You walk in openly, you die. Both of you. Before you get within 100 yards of the marshal. Clara set down her cup of coffee. She looked at Elijah, and something in her expression had hardened. Overnight crystallized, like water freezing the same substance, but transformed into something stronger and sharper and capable of cutting. "We do not sneak in," she said. May stopped wrapping the bandage. Elijah turned from the window where he had been watching the street. "We walk straight into the church," Clara continued. "Confront him publicly, in front of the whole congregation, in front of every respectable citizen in Carson City who has been shaking his hand and taking his money and telling themselves that Marcus Denton is a good man because it was easier to believe the lie than face the truth." She paused. "We make him show everyone what he really is. We do it in the one place where he cannot control the narrative, the one place where 200 witnesses are already assembled, the one place where killing us in plain sight would prove everything we are accusing him of." The logic of it settled over the room like a cold wind. It was insane. It was brilliant. It was the kind of plan that only someone who had been completely powerless could conceive, because only someone who had been powerless understood that the most devastating weapon against a powerful man was not a gun, but an audience. Elijah checked his Colt. 6 rounds. Fully loaded. He turned the cylinder slowly, listening to the mechanical click of each chamber rotating into position, the sound precise and final. "That is suicide," he said. "That is justice. You said it yourself. This is about making sure he can never hurt anyone else. Not about sneaking around in the dark trying to catch him alone. Not about putting a bullet in him from behind a rock and riding away. About standing in front of everyone he has fooled and tearing the mask off his face and letting the whole world see what is underneath." She met his eyes, held them the way she had held that jagged rock in the canyon, with the grip of someone who has made their decision and will not be moved from it. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "I ran away from my wedding. I stabbed the man who bought me with scissors. I climbed through a window in my bare feet and ran 3 days through a desert. I nearly drowned in a river. I crawled through a burning building. Do not ask me if I am sure." Elijah studied her for a long time. The morning light through the laundry windows caught the remnants of the wedding dress, the torn lace, the scorched hem, the fabric stained with the evidence of everything she had survived to reach this moment. She was 22 years old. She had been traded by her father, hunted by killers, nearly drowned, nearly burned alive. And she was standing in a laundry in Carson City telling a 43-year-old mountain man who had survived 3 of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War that she was going to walk into a church full of her enemies and dare them to stop her. He nodded. May Sullivan looked from one to the other. Then she crossed herself and pulled a shotgun from behind a stack of folded sheets. "Daniel would have wanted me to help," she said. "Tell me what you need." Sunday morning. The church bells of Carson City rang across the valley, their sound carrying through the clear mountain air with the authority of something that had been doing this every week for decades and saw no reason to stop. The Methodist Church stood at the center of town, white clapboard tall steeple windows of colored glass that threw patterns of red and blue and gold across the wooden pews when the morning sun hit them at the right angle. 200 of Carson City's finest citizens had gathered inside. Men in dark Sunday suits, their hats hung on pegs by the door. Women in elaborate dresses, their hands folded in their laps. Children squirming on the hard wooden pews while their parents pretended to listen to Reverend Josiah Moore's sermon about the wages of sin and the promise of redemption. Marcus Denton sat in the front pew, gray-haired, now distinguished, wearing a suit of dark wool that had been tailored in San Francisco and cost more than most families in Carson City earned in a full year. His boots were polished to a mirror shine. His hands rested on his knees, relaxed, confident, the hands of a man who owned the room and knew it. The image of a successful businessman, a generous benefactor, a pillar of the community whose donations had paid for the new church organ and the school expansion and the bridge across Miller Creek. Chester Poole sat beside him, large, perspiring, his collar too tight, his face flushed, his small eyes moving constantly toward the door and back again with the involuntary rhythm of guilt. He held his hymnal but did not sing. His lips moved occasionally, but the words were not worship. They were the silent calculations of a man counting threats and exits and the probability that his world was about to collapse. In the back pew alone, Flint Hargrove sat with his hat on his knee and his gray eyes on the door. The congregation was singing a hymn about mercy. 200 voices raised in harmony, the sound filling the church with the kind of collective faith that can make even a doubter feel for a moment that perhaps there is something larger than the sum of individual human cruelties. The minister stood at the pulpit with his arms raised, his Bible open, his face lifted toward the colored light streaming through the windows. The hymn was on its 3rd verse when the front doors of the church opened, both of them, wide. The morning sunlight poured in like a flood, and 2 figures stood silhouetted in the doorway, backlit by the brightness of the day, their shapes dark and sharp-edged against the light. Elijah Stone walked in first, Winchester rifle in his right hand, hanging at his side, but not aimed, not yet. Dust covered his clothes. Blood had dried to a dark brown on his shirt, stiff and cracking with each step. His beard was matted with sweat and sand. His eyes burned in a face that was cut and bruised and sunburned, the face of a man who had walked through fire and emerged on the other side still standing, still moving forward, still carrying something that could not be stopped by bullets or walls or the comfortable lies of respectable men in Sunday suits. He looked like something that had come out of the wilderness, because that was exactly what he was. Every head in the church turned. The hymn died mid-verse, voices trailing off one by one like candles being blown out in sequence until the only sound was the echo of the last note fading in the rafters and the measured footsteps of a mountain man walking down the center aisle of a house of God with a rifle in his hand and justice in his chest. The minister clutched his Bible to his body like a shield. His mouth opened. No words came out. Marcus Denton. Elijah's voice filled the church. Not shouting, not raised, spoken at the volume of absolute certainty, the volume a man uses when he has traveled past anger and past fear and arrived at the place where the truth is the only thing left, and it does not need to be loud because it is already the most powerful sound in the room. Step outside. We have business to settle. Denton did not stand. He did not flinch. He did not reach for the weapon that Elijah knew was hidden inside his coat, because men like Denton always carried weapons to church the way other men carried prayer. He simply sat in his pew and smiled, that cold, familiar smile. The smile Elijah remembered from the courtroom 2 years ago when the judge announced that all charges had been dismissed and Denton had turned to look at Elijah with the patient amusement of a man watching an insect struggle against a window pane. Elijah Stone Denton said, "The mountain man, still chasing ghosts, still convinced that one man with a rifle can change the world if he only believes hard enough. Tell me, Stone, did you practice that entrance or does melodrama come naturally to you?" The ghost of Tommy Graves. Elijah walked down the center aisle, slow, deliberate. Each boot step echoing on the wooden floor, measured and final the footsteps of a man who has walked 200 miles to reach this moment and will not be turned aside by words or threats or the condescending smile of a murderer in a good suit. The ghost of Daniel Whitfield, and every other innocent person you have killed to protect your stolen gold operation with Chester Poole. The words landed like stones thrown into still water. Ripples of shock spread through the congregation. Gasps, whispered exclamations, the sound of bodies shifting on wooden pews as 200 people simultaneously realized that their Sunday morning worship had become something else entirely. Chester Poole made a sound, a small strangled noise in the back of his throat, the sound of a man whose worst nightmare has just walked through the door wearing boots and carrying a rifle. Marshal William Cole stood from a back pew, tall, weathered, silver mustache neatly trimmed, a federal badge on his vest that caught the colored light from the stained glass windows and threw small rainbows across the polished wood of the pew in front of him. His hand rested on his gun, not drawing, not threatening, but present ready, communicating with the fluency of a man who had worn a badge for 30 years that he was in control of this situation until he decided otherwise. "Mr. Stone, I am going to need you to explain that accusation." And then Clara walked through the door. She came in behind Elijah, and the sight of her stopped the breath of every person in that church. 22 years old, barefoot, wearing the ruins of a white wedding dress, the fabric torn and burned and stained with mud and blood and river water, and 3 days of running through a landscape that had tried its best to kill her. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, dark against the white dress, tangled with the evidence of canyons and tunnels, and the ashes of a house that had been set on fire around her while she slept. She held Daniel's journal in her left hand. Her right hand hung at her side, and somewhere inside the sleeve of that ruined dress a knife waited with the patience of a thing that knows its moment is coming. The image hit the congregation like a physical blow. A bride, destroyed, standing in a church. The symbolism was so raw, so visceral, so perfectly aligned with every story about innocence violated and justice demanded that even the people who did not understand what was happening felt it in their chests like a punch. My brother documented everything. Clara's voice carried to every corner of the church clear and steady, without a tremor, without hesitation. The voice of a woman who had crawled through darkness and fire to reach this moment and would not waste it on doubt. Names, dates, locations. Union Army gold stolen during the war, laundered through the Comstock lode mines, sent east as legitimate silver profits. It is all here, Marshal. Everything you need. She held out the journal. Cole took it, began flipping through pages. His expression changed as he read, hardening line by line from professional interest to something colder and more dangerous, the expression of a lawman looking at evidence that confirms every suspicion he has carried for years but could never prove. And this Clara said. She reached inside her dress and produced the folded bank documents. Poole's signature. Chester Poole own handwriting on contracts authorizing the transfer of stolen federal gold through his mining operations. My brother made copies. I sewed them into the lining of this wedding dress, the dress Mr. Poole bought for me, the dress he put me in to deliver me to his bed. She held out the papers. Her hand did not shake. Her voice did not waver. She was a 22-year-old woman standing in a room full of people who had shaken. Chester Poole's hand and dined at his table and accepted his donations and never once asked where the money came from, and she was telling them the truth with the evidence to prove it, and she was daring them to look away. Poole erupted from his pew like a man who has sat on a nail. His face was the color of raw meat purple and mottled sweat running in streams from his temples. "That is a forgery," he shouted. "That woman is a liar. A thief. She stole those papers. She is deranged, hysterical. You cannot possibly take the word of a runaway girl over a man of my standing and reputation and contribution to this community. Sit down, Mr. Poole." Marshal Cole's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of federal authority, and Poole sat. Not because he wanted to, because his legs made the decision for him the way a dog sits when the master's voice drops to a certain register. Cole continued reading. The church was silent except for the rustle of pages turning and the labored breathing of Chester Poole and the almost imperceptible sound of 200 people holding their breath. Denton's mask slipped, just for a moment, just long enough for Elijah to see what was underneath the smile and the suit and the expensive boots and the donations to the church building fund. Pure hatred. Not hot. Cold. The concentrated, patient hatred of a man who has built his entire life on the ability to control what other people know and believe, and has just watched that control shatter in real time in front of the only audience that matters. Then the mask was back, smooth, confident, amused. "That woman is a savage and a thief," Denton said, his voice easy, conversational, the voice of a man addressing a minor misunderstanding at a dinner party. "She and Stone murdered my men, killed them in cold blood in the desert. Check the canyon south of here. You will find the bodies. These accusations are the desperate fabrications of a fugitive and a mountain hermit who has been unstable since the war." "Save it for the trial," Elijah said. Denton's hand moved, smooth, casual, the movement of a man adjusting his coat. But Elijah had been reading movements like that since Antietam had been alive for 23 years because he could tell the difference between a man reaching for a handkerchief and a man reaching for a weapon in the time it takes a heart to beat once. His Colt cleared leather before Denton's fingers touched the hidden pistol inside his coat. The barrel leveled at Denton, his chest steady as the stone wall of the church behind him, unwavering as the conviction that had carried Elijah 200 miles to stand in this exact spot at this exact moment. "Go ahead," Elijah said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. The voice of a man offering an invitation he hopes will be declined, but is fully prepared to honor. "Give me a reason." Denton froze. His hand stopped halfway to his coat. His eyes locked on the barrel of the Colt 3 feet from his chest, and for the first time since Elijah had known him, something besides confidence showed in those eyes. Something that looked, if you caught it in the right light, like the first faint shadow of doubt. Around the church, 4 of Denton's men began to rise from their seats, hands moving toward guns, faces set with the professional determination of men who were being paid well enough to kill in a church on a Sunday morning. Marshal Cole drew his own weapon. The sound of the hammer cocking was very loud in the silence. "Anyone moves, they answer to federal law. This is my jurisdiction. Every man in this room will sit down and keep his hands where I can see them, or I will put a bullet in the first person whose fingers touch iron. That is not a threat. That is a promise from a man who has been keeping promises for 30 years. Standoff. 10 seconds that felt like 10 centuries. The silence was so complete you could hear the candles flickering on the altar, hear the breathing of 200 people who had come to church to sing hymns and hear a sermon and were now sitting in the middle of something that might erupt into bloodshed at any moment. Children pressed against their mothers. Women gripped their husbands' arms. Old men who had seen violence before sat very still with the patient alertness of people who know that stillness is sometimes the only thing standing between you and a bullet. Then Flint Hargrove stood up. He rose from the back pew slowly, carefully. His hands were visible empty, held slightly away from his body in the universal gesture of a man who wants everyone in the room to know that he is not reaching for a weapon. His gray eyes swept the church, once taking in the congregation, the Marshal Elijah Clara Denton, the 4 hired guns frozen in various stages of reaching for their holsters. Marshal Hargrove said. His voice was calm, flat, empty. The voice of a man who has carried something heavy for a very long time and has decided in this moment in this place to set it down. I would like to make a statement. The temperature in the church dropped, not literally, but every person in the room felt it, the sudden chill that comes when the trajectory of events shifts in a direction that no one anticipated and everyone knows will change everything. Marcus Denton, his face went white, not pale, not gray, white, the color of fresh snow, the color of bone, the color of a man watching his entire carefully constructed world begin to collapse brick by brick, starting with the one brick he never imagined would move. Flint. His voice cracked on the name. The first crack Elijah had ever heard in that smooth, controlled baritone. The first sign that beneath the suit and the smile and the comfortable authority, Marcus Denton was capable of fear. Do not you dare. Hargrove did not look at Denton. He looked at Elijah. And something passed between the two men, something that traveled the length of the church in a fraction of a second. Something that did not have a name, but was understood by both of them with the clarity of two people who have spent their lives on opposite sides of a line and have arrived independently at the same conclusion about which side they should have been standing on all along. I am tired, Marcus. Hargrove's voice did not rise, did not fall. It stayed on one level note, the emotional monotone of a man who has gone past anger and past guilt and past justification and arrived at the place where the only thing left is the bare truth and the willingness to speak it regardless of the consequences. Tired of watching good people die for your profit. Tired of doing your killing and calling it business. Tired of waking up in the morning and not recognizing the man looking back at me from the mirror. He turned to face the congregation, 200 faces staring at him, 200 pairs of eyes, some shocked, some confused, some beginning to understand. I was there when we killed Tommy Graves. The words fell into the silence of the church like stones dropped into deep water, and like stones in water they sank, and kept sinking, and the ripples they created spread outward in every direction, touching every person in the room, changing the shape of the surface that would never be quite the same again. Denton gave the order personally. Hargrove continued. His voice did not waver. His gray eyes did not blink. Told us to make it hurt. Told us to make sure Stone found the body first. Said he wanted Stone to suffer. Said he wanted him to see what happened to people who stood up against him. Said it should be a message, an example. He paused, drew a breath, and when he spoke again, there was something in his voice that might have been the first sound Flint Hargrove's conscience had made in 15 years. The boy was 22 years old. He fought back, shot 2 of our men before we got him, and when he was lying in the dirt with 3 bullets in his chest, he did not curse us, did not beg. He said something to Stone, something I will never forget, something that has followed me into every night for 2 years. I will not repeat it here. That belongs to Stone. But I will tell you this. It was the words of a good man, and we killed him for it. The church erupted. It erupted the way a dam breaks, not all at once, but in stages. The first crack leading to a trickle, leading to a rush, leading to a wall of sound and motion that could not be contained or controlled or put back together. Women screamed. Men shouted. Someone knocked over a pew, trying to get away from the chaos. Children cried. The minister clutched his pulpit and called for order in a voice that no one heard because the truth had filled the room and there was no space left for anything else. Marcus Denton lunged, not for a weapon, for Hargrove. He came out of the front pew with a howl of pure rage, the sound of an animal that has been cornered, and knows it, the sound of a man whose mask has been ripped away in front of everyone who ever believed it, and who has nothing left to lose and nothing left to protect except the burning, all-consuming need to silence the voice that destroyed him. Elijah stepped between them. Denton threw a wild punch. Elijah blocked it with his left forearm, felt the impact travel up his arm and into his shoulder, where the bullet wound screamed in protest. He did not care. He drove his right fist deep into Denton's stomach. The man doubled over, gasping the air, leaving his lungs in a single explosive grunt. Elijah grabbed his collar with his left hand, pulled him upright, and slammed his head into the nearest church pew. The wood cracked. Blood sprayed across polished oak that had been cleaned and waxed that morning in preparation for the Lord's day. Once. Twice. Denton crumpled to the floor of the church. Broken. Beaten. Blood running from a gash above his eye, mixing with the dust on the wooden boards. His suit was torn. His carefully combed hair was wild. His mask was gone completely and permanently gone, and what lay beneath it was exactly what Elijah had always known was there. Not a businessman, not a pillar, not a respectable citizen, a murderer, a thief, a man who had built his castle on the bones of better people and decorated it with the profits of their death. But his eyes were still alive, still burning, still carrying the cold, patient hatred that had been the engine of his entire life. Elijah stood over him. The Colt was in his hand. He did not remember drawing it. But there it was, pointed at Marcus Denton, his head. The hammer cocked his finger on the trigger, the barrel 3 inches from the forehead of the man who had ordered the death of Tommy Graves. The world narrowed. Everything else disappeared. The church, the congregation, the marshal, Clara, Hargrove, the stained glass, the candles, the hymn books scattered on the floor. All of it fell away like scenery being struck after a play, leaving only this man, this gun, this choice. The moment Elijah had been walking toward for 2 years across 3 territories, up a mountain and back down again through a desert and a river and a fire to arrive at this point, this 3 inches of space between the barrel of a Colt .45 and the skull of the man who had taken everything from him. Do it. Denton's voice was a rasp wet with blood, but the hatred in it was undiluted. He smiled, teeth red with blood, eyes bright with the knowledge that this moment was his final weapon, that if Elijah pulled the trigger, Denton would win even in death, because he would have turned the mountain man into a mirror of himself, would have proved that all men are the same, when you strip away the pretense, would have demonstrated with his last breath that violence was the only truth and mercy was just weakness wearing a better name. Kill me, Stone. Prove you are just like me. Prove that everything you have been telling yourself about justice and righteousness was just another lie a man tells himself so he can sleep at night after doing what he really wanted to do all along. Elijah's finger tightened on the trigger. The metal was cold against his skin. The cylinder was loaded. The hammer was cocked. The distance was 3 inches. He could not miss, would not miss. One pull of the trigger, and Marcus Denton would stop existing, and the world would be lighter by the weight of one evil man, and Tommy Graves would be avenged, and Daniel Whitfield would be avenged, and every person Denton had ever hurt would have their answer. One pull. 3 inches. And then he heard it. Not from the church, not from the congregation, not from Clara or Hargrove or the marshal or any person present in that room. He heard it from inside himself, from the place where he kept the things that mattered most, the things that 2 years of mountain solitude had not been able to bury or freeze or starve into silence. Tommy's voice, clear as the church bells that were still ringing somewhere outside, asking the question that had followed Elijah through every mile and every night and every empty dawn on the mountain, the question that had brought him down from the ridge when he saw the footprints in the sand, the question that was the reason for everything, the reason he had not ridden past, the reason he had jumped into the river, the reason he was standing here now in a church in Carson City with a gun in his hand and a choice in his heart. Did I do good? And Elijah understood in the space between one heartbeat and the next what the answer to that question required. Not a bullet, not blood. Not the satisfaction of watching the light leave Marcus Denton, his eyes the way it had left Tommy, his eyes in the dirt on that empty road. The answer required something harder than killing, something that cost more than a bullet, something that only a man who had walked all the way to the edge of the darkness and looked over and chosen to step back could give. He lowered the gun. "No," he said. His voice was quiet, steady, the voice of a man who has just fought the hardest battle of his life and won it without firing a shot. "You stand trial. You hang legal, in front of the whole town, with a judge and a jury and witnesses and the full weight of the law that you spent 15 years corrupting brought down on your head like the hand of the God you have been pretending to pray to every Sunday in this church." He paused. "That is how Tommy would have wanted it. That is how Daniel would have wanted it. That is how justice works, not in the dark, not with a bullet, in the light, where everyone can see." Denton stared up at him from the floor. The smile was gone. The hatred was gone. What replaced them was something Elijah had never seen on that face before, something that looked like confusion, the bewilderment of a man who has spent his entire life operating on the assumption that every person is exactly as selfish and violent as he is and has just been presented with evidence that his assumption was wrong. Marshal Cole holstered his weapon, produced handcuffs from his belt. The click of steel closing around Marcus Denton's wrists was the most satisfying sound Elijah Stone had ever heard. Not because it was violent, because it was the opposite of violent, because it was the sound of a system working the way it was supposed to work, the sound of law replacing lawlessness, the sound of a promise kept to two dead young men who had believed in justice and paid for that belief with their lives. Chester Poole did not resist when Cole's deputies took him next. He went white and silent and limp the way a man does when the structure that has held up his entire existence collapses and there is nothing left to lean on. They led him out of the church in handcuffs past 200 people who had eaten at his table and accepted his charity, and never once questioned the source, and not one of those 200 people said a word in his defense. Denton's 4 hired guns surrendered their weapons without a fight. Professional killers to the last, they understood odds. They understood that the game was over. And they understood that a federal marshal with jurisdiction and a mountain man with a loaded rifle and a congregation of 200 witnesses made for the kind of situation that even the best hired gun does not walk away from. The church emptied slowly. People filed out in stunned silence, blinking in the morning sunlight like survivors of an earthquake trying to reconcile the safe, familiar world they had woken up in that morning with the world they now inhabited, a world in which the most respected men in their community were being led away in chains. 3 weeks later, the trial of Marcus Denton began in the Carson City Courthouse. It lasted 4 days, 12 jurors, 37 witnesses, evidence that stretched back 15 years and implicated half the wealthy men in Nevada. The courtroom was packed every day from dawn to dusk, standing room only, people pressed against the walls and crowding the doorways and spilling into the street where they strained to hear the testimony through open windows. Flint Hargrove took the stand on the first day. He sat in the witness chair with his hands flat on his thighs and his gray eyes fixed on a point somewhere above Marcus Denton's head and spoke for 4 hours without stopping. He described the killing of Tommy Graves in detail that made women in the gallery weep, and men gripped the arms of their chairs until their knuckles turned white. He described the order, the ambush, the 5 men on a dirt road, the boy who fought back and shot 2 of them before he went down, the boy who lay in the dirt with 3 bullets in his chest and asked if he had done good. He described the gold operation, the routes, the contacts, the bank accounts, the bribes, the bodies. Every corrupt official, every paid-off lawman, every disappearance that had been blamed on Apache raids or mining accidents or the simple convenient vastness of the Nevada desert that swallowed evidence the way it swallowed water. Clara took the stand on the second day. She wore a simple blue cotton dress that May Sullivan had given her, and her hair was pulled back, and her feet wore shoes for the first time in days, and she looked nothing like the ghost in the wedding dress who had walked into the church. She looked like what she was, a 22-year-old woman who had lost her brother and nearly lost her life and had run barefoot across a desert carrying the truth because someone had to and no one else would. She told the courtroom about Daniel, about his work as a scout, about the night the 6 men came, about hiding under the bed and watching her brother die in the doorway of their home, about the journal, about Chester Poole, visit to her room the night before the wedding, about the scissors, about the window, about the 3 days of running. She did not cry. She did not need to. The facts were enough. The facts were devastating. On the 3rd day, the prosecution presented the bank documents. Chester Poole is signature authenticated by 3 separate handwriting experts brought from San Francisco on contracts that authorize the transfer of stolen Union Army gold through his mining operations. Amounts, dates, account numbers. The signature on each document as distinctive and undeniable as a fingerprint. Marcus Denton, his lawyer, argued that the evidence was fabricated, that Clara was unreliable, that Hargrove was a disgruntled former employee with a vendetta, that the bank documents were forgeries. He argued for 6 hours with the passionate conviction of a man being paid $500 a day. The jury was not convinced. On the 4th day, the 12 men filed back into the courtroom after an absence of 10 minutes. 10 minutes, the shortest deliberation in the history of the Nevada Territory. The foreman stood, a rancher named William Price, 62 years old, gray-bearded, calloused hands, the kind of man who had spent his entire life measuring the world by the simple standard of right and wrong and had no patience for the complicated arguments that lawyers used to blur the line between them. Guilty. 7 counts: murder, conspiracy, theft of federal property, bribery of federal officials, racketeering, fraud, obstruction of justice. Marcus Denton, his face did not change when the verdict was read. Not on the 1st count, not on the 7th. He sat in the defendant's chair with his hands folded and his eyes fixed on the wall behind the judge and showed nothing, nothing at all, as if the man inside the suit had already vacated the premises and left behind only the shell, perfectly groomed, perfectly dressed, perfectly empty. Chester Poole received 20 years in federal prison. His mining empire was seized. His fortune was scattered to creditors and the federal government and the various injured parties whose claims filled a stack of legal documents 3 feet high. His name, which had once been spoken with respect and even reverence in the saloons and parlors of Carson City, became a synonym for corruption. Parents used it to frighten children. You behave or you will end up like Chester Poole. Marcus Denton was sentenced to hang. They built the gallows in the center of Carson City, on the same street where Denton had walked every day for years, tipping his hat to ladies, shaking hands with businessmen, smiling his cold smile at a town that had believed every word he said. Good timber, strong construction, proper knots tied by a man who had been doing this work for 20 years and took professional pride in ensuring that the mechanism functioned correctly. A clean death. That was the goal. Not mercy, exactly. Efficiency. On a bright October morning, they led Marcus Denton up the 13 steps to the platform. The sky was blue. The air was crisp with the first hint of autumn. The crowd filled the street in both directions. Hundreds of people come to watch the end of something that had poisoned their community for 15 years. Denton did not beg, did not cry, did not make a speech or a plea or a final statement. He climbed the steps with the measured pace of a man ascending a staircase in his own home, and he stood on the trap door with his back straight and his chin level and his eyes moving across the crowd with an expression that might have been contempt or might have been something else entirely. Something that no one standing below could read, because no one standing below had ever lived inside a mind like Marcus Denton is, and none of them wanted to. The hood went over his head. The rope was placed. The knot was positioned behind the left ear precisely professionally. The trap door opened. The rope did its work. Justice. Finally. After 2 years and 3 territories and a dead boy on a dirt road and a journal wrapped in oilcloth and a wedding dress burned and torn and stained with the evidence of everything it had cost to bring one evil man to account. Elijah Stone did not attend the hanging. He had already moved on. Marshal Cole found him at May Sullivan's laundry, saddling his horse, preparing to ride. The big dark gelding stood patiently while Elijah checked the cinch and adjusted the stirrups, the morning routine of a man who had been putting saddles on horses since before the war, and found in the repetitive precision of the work a kind of meditation that no church service had ever provided. "There is a reward," Cole said. He leaned against the doorframe and watched Elijah work with the unhurried patience of a man who had learned that some things could not be rushed. 10% of recovered assets. That comes to $15,000. More money than most men see in a lifetime stone. More money than most men can imagine. Elijah cinched the saddle, checked his rifle, slid the Winchester into the scabbard, and made sure it seated properly accessible from the saddle in less than 2 seconds, a habit that had kept him alive more times than he could count. "Give it to Miss Whitfield," he said. "She earned it. Every cent. And you—" Elijah swung onto his horse. The gelding shifted beneath him, adjusting to the weight, and Elijah settled into the saddle with the ease of a man returning to the one place in the world where he had always felt most himself. "I have somewhere I need to be." He rode out of Carson City on a Tuesday morning. The streets were quiet. The church bells were not ringing. The sun was climbing above the mountains to the east, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, and the air smelled of sage and pine and the distant clean scent of snow on the high peaks. He did not look back. 3 months later, Colorado Territory, the first snow of winter. Elijah Stone rode up a valley that opened before him like a promise kept. Mountains rose on both sides, their peaks white with early snow against a sky so gray and so still it looked like the lid of a world that had decided to close itself off from everything above and hold only what was inside. A creek ran through the center of the valley, cold and clear, the water so transparent that the stones on the bottom seemed to hover in mid-air. Pine trees stood tall and green against the gray soldiers of a gentler army guarding a border between the world as it was and the world as it could be. A small cabin sat tucked against the foothills where the pines gave way to a meadow that would be green with wildflowers in spring but was now white with fresh snow. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, thin and blue against the gray sky, the universal signal of warmth and shelter and the presence of someone waiting. A garden lay dormant under the snow, its careful rows still visible beneath the white patient sleeping ready to grow when the season turned. A corral held 3 horses who lifted their heads at Elijah, his approach ears pricked forward, breath making small clouds in the cold air. A woman stood on the porch. Clara Whitfield had used the $15,000 reward to buy 160 acres under the Homestead Act. Good land, water, timber, space enough to build something that would last longer than the life of the person who built it, something that would still be standing when the pines were old and the creek had carved its bed a few inches deeper, and the memory of Marcus Denton and Chester Poole had faded into the general history of a territory that was learning slowly and painfully the difference between civilization and the appearance of civilization. She wore no wedding dress, no white fabric, no lace. She wore a flannel shirt and riding trousers and boots that were already scuffed with the honest dirt of a woman who had been working her own land with her own hands. Her hair was pulled back in a practical braid. Her face was tanned from wind and sun. She looked like she belonged to this place, because she did, because she had chosen it, not been sold to it, not been delivered to it. Chosen it the way a free person chooses with her own mind and her own will and her own money earned by her own courage. "Took you long enough," she said. "Had some things to settle." Settled now, Elijah dismounted. They stood facing each other in the falling snow, 2 people who had walked through fire and river and darkness and come out the other side. 2 people who had answered the hardest questions honestly and found in that honesty something worth keeping. Something worth riding 3 months across open country to find again. He looked at the cabin, at the land, at the mountains rising white and eternal against the sky. He thought about Tommy, about Daniel, about the question Clara had asked in that canyon barefoot and bleeding and holding a rock like a weapon against the world. Do you only want my body like all the others? And how his answer, that simple, honest no, had led to everything after. Every bullet, every river, every fire, every moment of quiet truth spoken in darkness. Every choice that had brought him from a boulder in a Nevada wash to a porch in a Colorado valley with snow falling and coffee steaming. And a woman who had stopped being a stranger and become something he did not have a word for, because the word had not been invented yet, but would be someday by someone who understood that the deepest connections between people are not forged in grand gestures, but in the small, brave act of telling the truth when lying would be easier. "Yeah," he said, "I am settled." Clara handed him a cup of coffee. Steam rose in the cold air between them, curling upward like a question mark dissolving into the gray sky. Their fingers touched on the cup. Hers lingered. Not an accident, a choice. A woman who had been grabbed and grasped and clutched without her consent for as long as she could remember, choosing deliberately and with full awareness to let her hand rest on his. Choosing closeness. Choosing trust. Choosing to let another person near the places that had been hurt because she had decided based on the evidence of canyons and rivers and fires and long dark nights of truth-telling that this particular person would not add to the damage. Elijah did not pull away, did not lean in. He held still and let the moment be what it was. 2 hands on a coffee cup in the falling snow, the warmth of ceramic, the warmth of skin, the warmth of something that neither of them needed to name because naming it would have made it smaller than it was. They stood together on the porch, shoulder to shoulder, watching the snow fall on land that belonged to them. No more running, no more ghosts, no more mountains to climb alone. The Winchester leaned against the doorframe within reach but not needed. The land stretched out before them white and quiet and full of the kind of silence that is not empty but complete. 1 week later a letter arrived, brought by a rider who left it in the mailbox at the end of the property road and did not wait for a reply. The envelope was plain. The handwriting was neat, careful, the script of a man who had learned to write in a military academy and had never lost the discipline even after losing everything else. Mr. Stone, you think Poole operated alone? There are names in Washington that the Journal did not touch, men in suits who make Poole look like a shopkeeper. I have information. I have been collecting it for 15 years, waiting for a reason to use it. If you are interested, come to Flagstaff, Arizona before Christmas. Signed, F. Hargrove. Elijah read the letter twice, folded it, slid it into his coat pocket. Through the cabin window he could see Clara hanging a bridle on a nail by the corral gate, her breath making clouds in the morning air. The horses nuzzled her pockets, looking for the sugar she sometimes carried. The mountains stood white and patient behind it all, unchanged by anything that happened in the valleys below. Clara came inside, saw his face. "It is not over, is it?" "No, not yet. But right now, it does not need to be." She nodded, poured herself coffee, sat beside him at the table her hands had built from pine she had cut herself in the cabin, warmed by the fire she had laid that morning on the land she had chosen in the life she had made. "Not yet," she agreed. "And that is enough." Outside the snow kept falling, covering the tracks, filling the valleys, making the world new. And here is the lesson that was burned into every mile of that hard ride, branded into the hide of this story, like a mark that will not fade no matter how many seasons pass over it. The deepest wounds do not heal in isolation. They heal when we dare to see someone else's pain and choose not to add to it. When the world has taught a person that they are only worth taking from the most powerful thing you can give them is the truth that they are worth protecting, worth respecting, worth standing beside, not because of what they can give you, but because of who they are. Real strength is not about never getting hurt. It is about refusing to let your scars make you blind to someone else's wounds. It is about answering the hardest question honestly, even when everything inside you screams to walk away, to protect yourself, to keep the wall up and the door locked and the mountain between you and every living soul who might one day cause you pain. Because sometimes in choosing to see another human being fully, not as prey, not as property, not as a transaction or an obligation or a problem to be solved, but as a person who matters. You save them. And in saving them, you save the part of yourself you thought was already dead and buried on a mountain with the snow and the silence and the ghost of a boy who asked if he did good. He did good. They both did. Let me ask you something. When was the last time someone looked at you when the world had written you off and said you are worth more than this? When was the last time you chose to be that person for someone else? Not because it was easy, not because it was safe, but because it was right. Your stories remind us all that healing and hope still ride through the hardest deserts, that it is never too late to answer honestly, that one true word spoken in a canyon to a stranger can change 2 lives forever. If this story reached into your chest and pulled at something tender, share it in the comments. Tell me, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? I read every single one. And if these tales of grief and courage and justice and second chances mean something to you, subscribe. Turn on the notifications. Let us keep finding light in the dust together. Because one honest answer turned a mountain man who had given up on the world into a man standing on a porch with coffee in his hand and snow in his hair and a future he never thought he would have. And it is never too late to choose a better way forward. Thank you for being here. We do not ride alone.